Alright, so today we're going over end half laps. So it's another corner joint construction. Before we did miters. Now we're going over another type of joint that can be used for a corner. This can be used indoors, picture frames, any of those locations as well. Very strong joint, much stronger than a miter joint because we're creating all this surface area here where they're going to overlap and lock in together. What we're wanting it to be is perfectly flush here, perfectly flush on the outside edges, and perfectly flush on the surface. Okay? So, end half lap, once again, a great deal of contact area, so it's a very strong joint. Very easy to make, and very easy to make it accurate where you got it nice and tight in a good square corner if you do it correctly. Or once again, as we know with miters, if we don't get our parallel sides exactly the same or the angle exactly at a 45, then it's not going to turn out as well. So unless you absolutely need the aesthetics of the miter, a lot of times the end half lap's a better way to go. This is the only joint I use when I'm making doors that receive a glass insert. Okay, it's much easier to make them this way when doing that. You've probably seen this made as well for like a coffee table or something that has glass that's inserted inside the top of it. Once again, doors, frames, any type of frame, making a 90-degree corner, end half lap. Okay, so we have that. That's what we're going for. When you're making these, what you want to do is, as you're ripping down your rails or your stiles for your door or whatever type of frame you're making, you want to get a couple pieces of scrap. It does not have to be the same species, but it needs to be the exact same thickness, and chase it behind your board so that you have a board that replicates the exact same thickness and the exact same width of what you're going to make. And you're going to use those to set up the jig. Okay? The jig that we are using here to cut this, does anybody know what this is called? It's called a tenoning jig. Its primary purpose is for making tenons for the mortise and tenon table leg construction. So we're going to use the tenon jig here to make the half lap on the end of the board. Alright, so we're going to use the tenon jig. First thing we're going to have to do is take the blade guard off, because obviously the jig cannot pass the blade with the blade guard in place. So we're going to take the blade guard off. Once we have the blade guard off, the first thing we're going to do is raise the blade height to the width of the board. Okay, so we're just going to raise this blade up until the blade's the exact same height as the board. So again, you want your tooth at top dead center so that you're cutting the exact width of this board. So once we have done that, the next thing we are going to do is we're going to find the center of this stock. Now, majority of the time, the center of your stock is what? What is the thickness of the majority of wood we're working with? 3/4. So we're going to find half of 3/4. Top number stays the same. Bottom number doubles. We're going to go to 3/8 of an inch. We're going to mark it at 3/8 of an inch. Now, this should take you a couple passes. I've already set the jig up so that I know it's going to cut, and it's going to leave me 3/8 of an inch left over on my cut. Okay? You might have to make multiple adjustments, micro adjustments to get it, making it where it's leaving you exactly 3/8 of an inch left. I've already done that. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick it in here in the jig, make sure it's all the way down against the table, all the way back against the jig, and then tighten this handle up right here. Okay? Once we've done that, we're just going to make sure there's nothing in the way. As you guys can see, I've pushed the outfeed table away so that the jig can slide through the miter gauge slot to the opposite side. Once you make that cut, you want to make sure you take the board, if you're doing the opposing side, and rotate it 180. As you guys can see here, the thick side was against the jig. It was laying in this orientation. So the thick side was against the jig, and the thin side is what we're going to be removing. This is our 3/8 of an inch remainder. Okay, so we want to make sure that 3/8 stays against the jig, so we're going to rotate it 180. A lot of times people will flip that, and they'll end up with a cut on the opposing side, and it won't line up correctly. So I'm going to tighten that up, cut the other side. So once you have your jig set to cut the right size of end lap, you're going to cut the ends of every one that you need for this to go together. Okay, obviously, if I was doing this, I'd have all four. I've already cut 2 of them to make it. Now I have the remainder of the 2 here to cut the 4 to make the frame. So if I'm doing this and setting up the jig to make sure it's correct, how I check this is I use the Brady Lawn saw and I raise the blade up. Once again, this is not accurate in doing this. This is just to set the jig. As you can see here, I did not make a clean cut on that. It still has the remainder off, but I can set it on top of each other like this and see if my surfaces are smooth. Does that make sense? So that's the only reason why I did it on there, was to expedite the process so I can check to see if I have the jig left or right set correctly. So now that I have that, I'm good to go. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to cut these shoulders off so they're exactly the right depth off of the end, so that this, when it lines up, these edges are also flush. Okay, so to do that, we're still going to stay with the table saw, but we're going to use a miter gauge cross-cutting process on the table saw. So we want to make sure we have all of these cuts prior to doing this, because we're going to drop the blade height down. So now what we're going to do is we're going to drop the blade height down, so this end lap slides right over the top of it. Okay, once we have that done, we're going to pull it up and we're going to cut the shoulder off exactly where it needs to be, but we want to have a stop block. What we know is we cannot use the fence and the miter gauge in combination with one another because it creates a binding action. So what you're going to do is you're going to get a piece of scrap wood or a piece of the material you're already using. You're going to insert that in there. Pull it up to where you want it. Lock the fence down. Might be taking off just a little bit too much. Once again, the first cut's going to take you the most amount of time to get it set up. So when I make this cut, I'm going to leave this board behind so that I'm not getting any binding happening during that process. Again, what we're looking for here is to see if that shoulder is perfect. If not, I still need to take off just a minuscule amount. That's going to be pretty close right there. Alright, that's it. So once you have it perfectly set, you can double check it with the other piece to make sure. And it's good. Now the process can be expedited. Once again, we want to make sure we're cutting the small piece off of the bottom, not the top. That's the piece that we want to keep. And you technically are getting a kickback here, but it's just that little piece there. It's not going to hurt anything. Just let it slide back. There it is right there. So at that point, you've cut the end laps on every piece. Perfectly flush on the top, perfectly flush on the end. If I put all my pieces together here, I should have a frame. Now the only thing we want to take into consideration when we glue this frame up is we always want vertical lines in our frame being exposed, so the side that has the vertical lines would be the outside or the side that we want to see, and the side with the horizontal lines here is the back. So we always want to see vertical lines in our projects. End half lap. Make sense? All right, what was the name of this jig used to cut it? Kennedy jig. What was the name of this to cut on the table saw? Miter gauge. How high do we raise the blade to set for cutting the end lap? Just the width of the board that's being cut. Okay. How much? Once again, standard stock is 3/4. How much is the amount that is left here? 3/8. Okay. Where could this be used at?
Coffee table, mirrors.
Frames, which could be picture frames, mirrors, could be coffee table where it's getting inset, glass doors, any of those things. Once again, what makes this joint strong is the amount of contact area there, and it also gives you two 90-degree shoulders. So once you push that together, you should have 100% 90-degree angle with an extremely strong joint. Make sense? End half laps.